If you were to ask your average cringe normie that didn't squander their future prospects pursuing a history degree to name an English king, or just any old monarch, they'd most likely say to you, "Don't worry mate, I don't read the big issue, but keep the money for yourself," before looking at you with disdain, barely masked with pity as you crawl out of your bin and attempt to wiggle out of your sleeping bag. As your eyes meet, their mouth forms a toothless smile, and they regurgitate the immortal words in a low whisper. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, as they begin to twist their body into the vague likeness of a crab and scuttle off down this rat-infested alleyway that you have learned to call home. In other words, if you know less than nothing about history, you have at least heard of Henry VIII and that he was not a good chap, but how well deserved is this eternally infamous reputation for one of the most significant people in Britain's Long Island story? That surely the man had redeeming qualities, or at the very least, effective policies, which begs the question that nobody asked: is Henry VIII misunderstood, historically speaking, as the quintessential tyrannical king? Was he in fact based, or was this infamous reputation he has earned himself warranted? Does he remain cringe? So what we're going to do is very simple. We're going to speedrun each side of the argument and see where he ends up on the tier list. So grab yourself a choice beverage and some recreational drugs, because today that's the very question we are going to answer once and for all, starting off with the cringe.
There's no question, Brexit means Brexit. Cheers.
Now, it can be hard for us to imagine that this walking PSA warning of Scottish chip shops inspired a good amount of optimism in his youth. He did all the things a young royal should. He was well-educated, intelligent, handsome, athletic, and boy was he confident, following just as I do in the eternal words of Sir William Galahad. Quote, "If you are not confident, you are a fucking bag of pork scratchings." And how could he not be? Just have a look at that battered codpiece, will you? Core and all blimey. But most importantly, he invaded France a lot, and maybe even, and I cannot believe these words are coming out of my mouth, but maybe even a bit too much, if such a concept can exist. You see, Henry is often criticised for these invasions that characterise the foreign policy of his reign. You see, these invasions, not to mention his own lavish spending, were costly and largely pointless. Now, this would result in higher taxes, debased currency, inflation, and long-term economic instability, earning him the nickname Old Coppernose. But I hesitate to criticise a man for trying to tackle the mental health epidemic faced by his subjects. I think that's commendable. However, the fact that these invasions and battles aren't by any means well known kind of goes to show just how pointless and inconsequential they were. But what is well known about Henry is, of course, the killings. Toxic masculinity, if I have ever seen it.
What's your thoughts on, like, toxic masculinity?
Big man thing, I don't even know what that hyper masculinity thing is, bruv, but shout out to my LGBTQ people, bruv, you get me.
These executions included, but were not limited to, his wives, his friends, his most effective politicians, responsible for the small amount of good that he did achieve, and up to 72,000 poor, unnamed bastards that disagreed with his approach to governance and, gutting the religion that their lives revolved around. And it's important to remember that a lot of these executions were based entirely on fabricated claims, manipulated evidence, and false confessions. He even passed the Treason Act, making it punishable by death to deny the king's supremacy, even in private conversation, which is a bit cringe. But are British, or more specifically English Republicans, even really people? I wouldn't have thought so, which kind of tempts me to put this in the based section, but, well, as Chuck would say,
any man who must say.
Now, in a nutshell, Henry's reign is characterised by short-sighted, destructive policy in order to fulfil personal ambition. Now, most notably, his desire for a male heir. Now, first on the chopping block, we have Catherine of Aragon. Wait, what the fuck? We have Catherine of Aragon. Now, this monkey-obsessed weirdo was pretty based, actually. You see, while Henry was out winning pointless victories, but victories nonetheless, in France, most notably the Battle of the Spurs.
It's just who we are, mate. It's just who we are. It's who we're going to be till as long as I'm here.
His pregnant wife was winning battles against the Scots. However, after 24 years of marriage, the alliance she brought with Spain and the Holy Roman Empire had crumbled, and she gave birth to only one more child than I have. Pathetic numbers. A daughter called bloody. Last name Mary. The less said about her, the better. But as we previously discussed, Henry was a learned man, so he did what any self-respecting scholar does, which is to read religious text until you find a passage vague enough to back up any pre-existing arguments you want validated. And in the Bible, it warns against shagging your brother's wife at risk of penile implosion, so she's got to go. And if that means starting your own church with blackjack and hookers, well, so be it. Sometimes it's just got to be done, and fuck everybody else in the country for whom this is the centre of their very lives, not to mention the elderly and poor who relied upon the monasteries for rudimentary healthcare and education as the only available social safety net, keeping them from homelessness and death, which is a bit of a piss take, not least because the church land was now sold to his sycophantic nobles, which in turn pushed these peasants off their land with now no social safety nets available to them. And it's important to remember that when Henry split from the Roman Catholic Church, he didn't just simply convert the nation to Protestantism, but instead Anglicanism, which is the national religion in the UK to this day. And Anglicanism is this weird mixture of Protestant and Catholic, meaning it's pissed off and persecuted both sides, enforced by good old-fashioned heresy laws. Even if it is often seen in more alignment with Protestantism. At first it was actually far more Catholic, with the exception of an English Bible, and, not acknowledging the Pope. It's kind of based. But the point is that it put Britain on a pretty unique trajectory outside the religious politics of mainland Europe, and is at this point that a lot of historians do point to as the first major step toward I think Euroscepticism is a bit too on the nose of a word, a bit too modern, but this idea of feeling or being seen by the continent as detached from it, which persists to this day with Brexit and perfidious Albion and so on and so forth. And as you can imagine, this caused a bit of turmoil, to say the least, and this instability would last far longer than just Henry's reign, which leads us to Anne Boleyn, who committed the same deadly sin as Catherine, only bearing him a daughter, Elizabeth, arguably the monarch who would finally put a halt to the turmoil Henry had wrought. What can I say? She was just based like that, hence the speculations of penile growth that surround her. And it's throughout this marriage with Anne that Henry suffered a severe jousting accident that would leave him with a chronic ulcerating sore on his leg, resulting in immobility and obesity, the 54-inch wasted image we are familiar with today. And this accident does correlate with a heightened level of tyranny throughout his reign, becoming far more paranoid, volatile, cruel, and despotic.
He's got the brain scramblies.
The dissolution of the monasteries would accelerate, executions and perceived traitors became far more frequent, and his relationships became more transactional, more fraught. What can I say? Insecurity is one hell of a drug. So he had his new top boy, his new yes man, his new hand of the king, Thomas Cromwell.
He's my homeboy, my rotten soldier. He's my sweet cheese, my good time boy.
Get a coerced confession from a courtier suggesting Anne's infidelity and plotted regicide, and it was the chopping block for her. Next we have Jane Seymour, who finally birthed him a son, hit the Rashford one time, then fucking died, but sometimes the death of your fourth wife from childbirth is just the price you've got to pay for. Okay, let's not mince words here. The kid was kind of a piece of shit, but a son nonetheless. But there's no time for grieving. She would want you to move on, I'm sure of it. And it was the next wife that would be the death of Thomas Cromwell. You see, he fell for the oldest trick in the book, and there's no easy way of saying this. The guy got catfished. Look, it happens to the best of us. I don't know if it's deserving of death, but when Anne of Cleves arrived in court, she did not look like her profile picture.
You are a fucking catfish!
And yes, it is canon that Henry vigorously wanked to this painting more than once. What can I say? Guys only want one thing, and it's disgusting: a backup male heir to secure their royal lineage for the stability of the realm. But don't feel too bad for her. She was ugly enough to be worthy of divorce and a few quid, which is about the best you can hope for with this chap. Then we have Catherine Howard, who it actually appeared was adulterous, and well, look, I'm not saying that she deserved to die, but read the room, love. Like, if there was ever one guy not to evidently cheat on, do you know what I mean? Like, have a bit of self-preservation, it's fucking daft.
Abuse is abuse.
Well, finally, we have Catherine Parr, who was actually pretty based. She was seemingly a good stepmother to Mary and Elizabeth, helping them regain their position in line to the throne, narrowly avoiding death for her Protestant views by simply outliving Jabba the Hutt before he could feed her to the Rancor. A round of applause for her. You simply love to see it. Now, Henry's reign was marked with high taxation to bail out pointless, bankrupting wars to fill little beyond his own ego. The very fabric, the bedrock of the nation, had been torn apart for the sake of his own personal ambitions, left in the hands of a sickly 9-year-old boy who would sabotage his own succession before dying prematurely. A king who prioritized personal power, legacy, and ego, most of which he catastrophically failed to achieve over the welfare of his own people and the stability of his realm. To live in an England under Henry VIII was filled with terror, despotism, and turmoil. Or so the haters would have you believe. Now, I'll be honest, I'm a bit sick of the Tudors myself. They're the entry-level stuff that gets drilled into you in school before you move on to harder stuff, like Nazi drug use. But there's a reason Henry VIII is so well known regardless of your interest in history. The man really was the content king. He is the story that keeps on giving. His villainy as the quintessential tyrannical king is simple and easy to understand. He wants a son, so he kills his wives. But it goes without saying, it is of course something of a caricature. Now, I'm sure you've all heard the rumours by now, the rumours this very video has paid lip service to, the accusations about his marital spats, Catholic lies and slander from the mouths of gingers with hair as red as Lucifer's sex net.
It's a pleasure swing, you fucknut, not a sex net.
Okay, he did kill some of his wives, but did it ever occur to you that maybe they didn't deserve the man that brought all of this green space to the nation's capital city, an eco-warrior 500 years ahead of his time that would have given King Charles a run for his money? And how did he achieve this, I hear you ask? Well, it's rather simple. By abolishing the national religion, as you do, he was able to confiscate the church land so that the wildlife could flourish, and occasionally, yes, he would go on environmentalist missions to make sure that their numbers didn't get too high. Hunting, some people call it, but everyone's a cynic these days. They need to open more youth centres, I reckon. Now, his breaking with the Catholic Church is often seen as a short-sighted personal means to be done with his own marriage, or marriages, in pursuit of a male heir, because, well, as we all know, girls are in fact feminine, which means that they are gay by definition, and the ones that aren't feminine are scientifically men, because, you see, achievement is a male quality, and as we all know, success causes penile growth. I've covered the early modern scientific and historical arguments for this in my video on identity theft, which is worth a watch. I mean, I would say that, but I think it's half decent. However, it's important to understand the situation Henry finds himself in. He doesn't just want a son because women are cringe. He needs, or at least thinks he needs, he wasn't to know Elizabeth would girl boss quite that hard. In regard to Mary, he was probably right, far too emotional with all that burning people alive stuff, do you know what I mean? Henry would never. But he thinks he needs a son because of just how precarious the Tudor dynasty was at this point. It's important to remember he was only the second Tudor monarch, and the Tudor dynasty was basically created by marrying two sides of a nationwide civil war. He was half York, half Lancaster, and the smallest hint of fuckery, of silly buggers, and either one of these sides will see him as the opposing half of his birth. The position of his dynasty is incredibly precarious. A son, from a contemporary perspective, is infinitely more stable for the dynasty and the lineage, and therefore the nation. So by speedrunning through wives at the pace he was, this was selfless behaviour. The man was a hero, and in regard to splitting from the Catholic Church, well, sure, there was a bit of turbulence, but it did to some extent strengthen the position of this shaky monarchy as the new head of the church, aligning the political and the religious, allowing further taxation and weakening and overpowering and over-threatening nobility. And not just any nobility, and outdated nobility of Norman design. Norman meaning French, French meaning inherently bad. And with this consolidation of power in the crown, it allowed him to title himself Daddy, or more formally, Your Majesty, which still persists to this day. Now, I don't really have an opinion on this. I just think it's a funny thing to personally suggest people start calling you. I'd love to hear that conversation between him and Wolsey, and it goes without saying that there's a lot of land and a lot of wealth you can extract from a church you have just dissolved. It provided England far more religious autonomy and political independence outside the nation as well as within, and, well, just look at the modern day. The Vatican has been infiltrated by Yanks following political assassination. It's not inconceivable to award the man a far-sighted W on the scoreboard here. I'm just saying, you know. You come here for the hard-hitting facts, and I'll be damned if that's not exactly what I give you. And in regard to the European, and more relevantly the English Reformations, they inevitably lead into this more enlightened and, dare I say, woke nonsense philosophical trajectory. And as we see with Henry's patronage of the arts and the sciences, even founding Trinity College, Cambridge, and the Royal College of Physicians, an attempt to improve the standard of medicine and do away with, you know, nonsense quackery. It's a step too far, I think, to call this the birth of English healthcare, as many do, but it was certainly a significant leap forward, and I do think he deserves credit for it. I mean, you'd think the brightest medical minds in the country could have warned an immobile man that 5,000 calories a day probably wasn't the best idea, but I don't really blame them. Execution seemed to be his go-to response in the face of a reality check, a philosophy that I'd be lying if I said I didn't live by myself. At the end of the day, he could have had a visible crack addiction and no one would have said shit to the guy. This is why you never go full Joseph.
Crack. I'm promoting it.
But in line with this enlightened trajectory was his interest and patronage of humanism, even if he did he did kill some of them who disagreed with him, but you know, you can't make an omelette without executing a few philosophers, as my nan used to say. All in all, this trajectory, which despite some fuckeries along the way, some of which still persist today, I think on the whole, in the long term, I'd stick a cautious W in the chat for it, personally.
W in the chat.
Now, I think it's safe to say that fiscal responsibility isn't a virtue you could realistically afford to old Coppernos here. He did restructure the Privy Council, which was basically like the small council from Game of Thrones. From about 100 people to about a dozen, to then basically just the whims of whichever bloke happened to be his favourite at the time. First Wolsey, then Cromwell. And this might sound trivial, you know, a bit boring, a bit gay, a bit Doge reform, if I dare to date this timeless classic of a video, but it didn't just cut a bit of admin cost, it arguably paved the way for a more centralised, streamlined governance, further implementing reforms such as the cyberpunk-esque Court of Augmentations, which oversaw and streamlined revenue and land collection from the dissolved monasteries. But the point I'm making is that in terms of legal and administrative reforms, he wasn't terrible, but he was far from notable, and these few examples weren't even really of his design. You have to reach a bit to praise him in this regard, but I'm going to give him half a point here for recognising that you're shit at your job and finding someone who's actually good at it to do it for you. I'd give some thanks in that regard.
Don't thank me, I've done nothing for you.
But the one standout, and I think clear intention that Henry did succeed in, was his unprecedented investment in the Navy. Now, while his investments in the army were cripplingly pointless, it's the same Navy built and funded by Henry that defeated the Spanish Armada under Elizabeth, and this was a victory spurred on by his massive investments in naval infrastructure. It's under Henry that Portsmouth becomes such a naval powerhouse, which is a massively significant contributing factor in Britain's power and success in the coming centuries, the Battle of the Armada arguably being that springboard. So it goes without saying that King Barry VIII's legacy is incredibly complicated, despite being, I think, fairly overshadowed by the whole, you know, killing of wives, friends, and perceived dissidents thing he had going on. Yes, he founded the Royal College of Physicians, but he also dissolved the monasteries, which provided a form of healthcare for the old and poor, but fuck those people, am I right? And this is a running theme you've probably noticed with Henry by now. Almost everything he did was kind of a double-edged sword. It's almost like you could describe his actions as a bit erratic. Almost. He is simultaneously one of the worst monarchs the country has ever had, but also kind of responsible for its future success. In his day, he was a real mover and shaker, was our boy Henry. He really turned the country on its head. His reign is one of the few times in English history to be looked at as almost something of a revolution, which is something we don't really do in this country unless it involves child labour and giant metal ships, because that's not revolution, that's just common sense. They're often more romantic than beneficial, at least in the short term, and that's kind of the case with our Henry. His reign was incredibly tumultuous, and I think it's fair to say that he failed pretty catastrophically in most of his personal ambitions, most notably the security of his dynasty. It was his very actions that would result in its implosion. But in the long term, he was unquestionably one of England's most significant monarchs, maybe even the most significant, and it's hard to deny that the reverberations of his legacy put England on track to become the dominant global power that it would, despite leaving the kingdom fractured and unstable, religiously, politically, and socially, setting the stage for future conflicts throughout the reigns of his children.
This one is Jewish Nazism. Absolutely base.
So with all that being said, where do we reckon he belongs? Well, straight away, let's just rule out the two he definitely isn't. He's not even close to being a George VI, and he's definitely not Special K. Say what you like about the guy, but it's very hard to have, to have absolutely no opinion of him whatsoever. I just look at the lad, he's never gone near the stuff. I'm genuinely flirting with the idea of asking him for feet pics. It's a bit controversial, that, isn't it? It's good for engagement, I suppose, but he's got to go in the bin. Like, are you kidding me? The guy was fucking evil. He was a right horrible bastard. You could say, oh, we had this intelligent, intellectual side to him, and that just makes his crippling insecurity and almost childlike tyranny even more contemptible. He killed 2 of his wives for a son that died prematurely. The only good thing he ever did was have people more competent than himself basically legislate in his stead, both of whom he either betrayed or killed for trivialities. You wouldn't call Robert Baratheon a good king because he put John Arryn in charge, would you? That's fucking insane. But he's not Tom Cruise. He's not an alien. Like, you can understand him on a human level, awful as he was. Like, he never sacrificed a toddler and feasted on his entrails or whatever the fuck that guy gets up to on his weekends. His actions, horrendous as they were, they did set up England for long-term success, and see, I don't think that was inevitable though. I don't even think it was necessarily intentional either. I think that's more of a compliment to those who followed him, people like Elizabeth, who were able to muddle through and make something constructive of his fuckery. If someone burns your house down and you build it back more secure, you don't thank the arsonist, do you? Which I think puts him firmly in cringe, but he did write Greensleeves though, didn't he? And that should not be forgotten. That shouldn't be We're gonna stick him in the bin. I think that seems about... No, that's a myth, isn't it, surely? There's no way that's true. He wishes he deserves the bin, straight into cringe. What a useless cunt, get rid of him, bosh, sorted. And that looks about right. And if you're looking for a man on the opposite side of the spectrum, a man whose insecurities drove him to saving the nation rather than fisting it despite loss of limb, well, look no further than my video on the betrayal of Lord Nelson. That seems about it. Like and subscribe, all the rest of it. See you later. Oh, and do us a favour, stick some half-decent TV shows in the comments, will you? I'm running dry at the moment, I need some suggestions. No fucking anime though, good lord. Have some mercy.